Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, and this video is the next reading in the book, Four Fundamental Questions. It is Rene Descartes, Discourse on Method. Our selection is from Part 5, and so there's a couple of pages from the Discourse on Method, and then there's another excerpt from The Passions of the Soul. It's just maybe 8 pages to read, a lot less than the Phaedo by Plato, which we had to read for the previous reading in the book. So I'm going to start this time by reading discussion question 1, and that'll help me frame an overview of the 2 readings by Descartes here. So discussion question 1, and again, these are the exam questions. There'll be a list of options of these discussion questions from which you can choose to answer your essay. One 250-word essay and 2 100-word essays on each exam. So the first discussion question: compare Descartes' view to the ideas in Hinduism and Buddhism. Which view do you think Descartes' ideas have more in common with? Explain. So, if you read Richard Bilsker's introductory paragraph at the beginning of Discourse on Method on page 71, he explains that, like Plato, Descartes is a rationalist and a dualist, and that's also going to be discussion question 2. So we also saw in the previous video about Plato's dialogue called the Phaedo, how similar his philosophy is to the Hindu philosophy that we read about in the Katha Upanishad. So Plato and the Hindus both believe in an eternal individual soul that existed before it inhabited our current material body. It will exist after this material body dies. Most likely it will recycle or reincarnate through other material bodies, and which body you get in your next life is contingent upon how well you can control your sense desires in this life, and the goal ultimately is to escape the cycle of reincarnation and return to the eternal spiritual world. So the main difference between Hinduism and Descartes is that Descartes does not believe in reincarnation. He does believe in an individual soul that is separate from the body, and he also believes in God, like the Hindus, who call God Vishnu. But he does not believe that the animals have souls. The Hindus do, and that's an important point, which is it's going to be important for the next 2 discussion questions about Descartes. But getting back to the first discussion question, what's the difference between Descartes and Buddhism? The Buddhists' argument is that there is no individual soul, that the word self is just a word. It doesn't signify any reality. All we actually experience are fleeting sense impressions. Our bodies are made of just different parts assembled temporarily together. There's no underlying unity that remains the same with itself from moment to moment. So there is no individual self. So Descartes agrees with the Buddhists in the respect that he agrees that animals don't have a soul. There is no self in an animal. They're just machines. They appear to be living creatures, but actually they're just very sophisticated machines made by God. And what differentiates us from the animals is we have reason. So, all right, so with that basic overview of discussion question 1 in place, I'll now go over Discourse on Method, the section from Part 5 that we're supposed to read in our book. So Descartes goes over what he talked about in the previous sections of the book, and I'll read here from page 72. after he talks about, he reminds his readers, we're all familiar with what's translated here as automata. So this, he lived from 1596 to 1650. So the early 17th century, people were making intricate clocks with figures that would go around in a circle, maybe a little boy with a hammer, and he'd hit the bell. So he's referring to machines, and this is his analogy. He said, well, we're familiar with the machines that humans can make, and they're pretty ingenious, but they seem to be different from material bodies, living bodies of humans and animals. But he says, actually, our material bodies, the animals' material bodies, they're just very sophisticated automata. They're just machines. At the top of page 72, he says, from this aspect, the body is regarded as a machine, which, having been made by the hands of God, is incomparably better arranged and possesses in itself movements which are much more admirable than any of those which can be invented by man. So there's a big point of his philosophy. There is a soul in a human being which is different from our body, which is just a machine created by God. So all of its working parts are a lot more sophisticated than the kinds of machines that a human could make. And then he goes on to say that if someone made a machine that looked like a human, even if they could somehow make the machine talk, and they didn't have recording devices that early, but he's saying it's easy for us to imagine someone could make a machine that would look and talk just like a human, but there's still two tests that he goes on to talk about by which you could determine that they are not a human and they're just a machine. And the first test is at the right in the middle of page 72. He says, but it never happens that it arranges. All right, the first is that they could never use speech or other signs as we do when placing our thoughts on record for the benefit of others. So he's saying it might be able to talk, but it wouldn't be able to have a conversation. It wouldn't be able to alter its speech patterns to answer appropriately to a question that you might ask. After a while of conversing with this machine that talks and looks just like a human, you'd be able to tell, oh, this is just a machine. And I think it's interesting to note that that's the same test that a man named Alan Turing came up with to determine when a computer achieves the level of artificial intelligence. So Alan Turing, there was a movie about him, I think in 2014. He was a British mathematician, and he led the team that broke the Enigma code of the Nazis. They would transmit their messages to each other with an encoding machine, and Alan Turing created a machine to crack that code, which helped the Allies win World War II. In 1950, he wrote a paper called Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence, and just like Descartes, he says, the way you'd be able to tell the point when a machine, a computing machine, reaches the same level of intelligence as a human is if you had some kind of a conversation with it, maybe typing back and forth. How long would it take a human being to figure out, oh, this is just a program responding in pre-programmed ways? There's no person on the other side thinking about what I'm saying and responding thoughtfully. He's saying if you couldn't tell that, if you couldn't tell, oh, this is just a program machine, then the machine has achieved artificial intelligence. And Descartes is saying that would never be possible, and that's one test by which you could differentiate a human from an intelligent robot. And the second test is like the first test on page 72. And the second difference is that although machines can perform certain things as well as, or perhaps better than any of us can do, they infallibly fall short in others, by which means we may discover that they did not act from knowledge, but only from the disposition of their organs. For while reason is a universal instrument which can serve for all contingencies, these organs have need of some special adaptation for every particular action. So what he's saying there is humans have reason, which he calls is a universal instrument which can serve for all contingencies. So anything that happens because humans have reason, we can figure out the chain of causes and effects and deal with the situation. We can adapt ourselves to any particular changing scenario. For example, humans can live underwater with scuba gear or in a submarine. Humans can fly in the air with airplanes. We can go into outer space. We can live in the desert. We can live on the top of a snowy mountain, because we can always figure out how to adapt ourselves or develop tools to help us adapt to any situation. That's what Descartes is saying. Animals can't do that. Polar bears can live in the icy cold a lot better than we can, but put a polar bear in the desert, they wouldn't be able to figure out how to survive. Birds can fly a lot more dexterously than we can with our machines, but a bird can't go to outer space. There are some religions I've read where birds can go to outer space, but at any rate, the point for this reading is Descartes saying these are the two tests by which you could tell the difference between a human and a human robot that can talk, and it's the same two tests that you can tell the difference between humans and animals. Animals, he's saying, they can't have a conversation with human beings, and they can't adapt to different environments very well. And some of the points, he says, well, parrots can talk, sure, but you can't have a conversation with a parrot where it responds appropriately. And he's saying also, even deaf people who are born deaf and mute, they can figure out ways to communicate. And the people who have leisure time to spend with them, they'll usually develop some kind of a symbolic system of communication. Now there's more well-established international sign languages and things like that. But back then, each individual would, I guess, make up their own individual language for the people in their immediate environment. He's saying if the animals had intelligence, they wouldn't even need to be able to talk. They would figure out a way to communicate with us. They never do, so it's not that they have very little reason, because even humans with very little reason can figure out how to communicate. Animals, the finest of their species, never can do that. So therefore, he's saying they don't have reason. The animals are machines made by God. They're just inanimate machines. They have no soul. Even if they make sounds like they have emotions and passions and act that way, he's saying that's just the programming of their parts. Nature, whatever he means by nature, material nature, is just interacting soullessly, and we can easily tell a difference between humans and animals, and so we can't. What makes humans different than animals is that we have reason, and he goes on to say there's no material cause of reason. We can't think of combinations of matter creating reason. So therefore, the soul must be something entirely separate from matter, which is an important point for our discussion questions, but also at the bottom of page 73. The bottom paragraph of page 73 is that I had described after this the rational soul and shown that it could not be in any way derived from the power of matter like the other things of which I had spoken, but that it must be expressly created. I showed too that it is not sufficient that it should be lodged in the human body like a pilot in his ship, unless perhaps for the moving of its members, but that it is necessary that it should also be joined and united more closely to the body in order to have sensations and appetites similar to our own, and thus to form a true man. All right, then he goes on to say that there's, next to the error of people who deny the existence of God, the next great error is people who see no difference between humans and animals. So he's talking about reincarnation. So he explicitly rejects the theory of reincarnation. So next to the error of those who deny God, there's none which is more effectual in leading feeble spirits from the straight path of virtue than to imagine that the soul of the brute is of the same nature as our own, and that in consequence after this life we have nothing to fear or to hope for any more than the flies and ants. So when we go back to discussion question 1, comparing Descartes to Hinduism, clearly that's a major difference. Now, the next reading is The Passions of the Soul, and this is where Descartes tries to explain how the soul interacts with the body. If the soul is totally separate from matter, and if the material body is completely a material machine, then where's the contact point between these totally different forms of being, totally different substances, a spiritual substance, a material substance? How do they interact? And his solution to this problem is that in the brain, in the middle of the brain, which is the pineal gland, that's the seat of the soul, and it's in that little gland in the middle of your brain that communicates information that tells the body how to move, and it receives information from the body to inform it about its environment. But as Richard Bilsker points out in his introductory note, that still really doesn't solve the problem, because the pineal gland is still a material substance, and the soul is an immaterial substance. So to say the soul is in the pineal gland, and then from there it radiates its motive force, doesn't explain how these two entirely different types of substance can interact. In cartoons and movies, if you see a ghost can walk right through a wall. A ghost has, sometimes in movies, a ghost can't pick anything up because its hand will just pass right through it. So that's the same kind of a problem Descartes is trying to solve, but he reduces it to the interaction between a soul and a pineal gland. It still doesn't explain how matter and soul interact. But his explanation is, in early 17th century biology, they knew a lot from dissecting human bodies about the nerves that come down from the brain to all of the muscles, the arteries. So his theory was that in the arteries, there's these little tubes. Well, actually, in the nerves, there's these little tubes, and those little tubes carry what he calls animal spirits. So some kind of a subtle material substance. That's kind of his intermediary element between the soul and the material body. So the nerves contain these animal spirits, and they all link up into the brain, in the center of which is the pineal gland. And the reason he thinks that's the seat of the soul is because all other parts of the body are dual. You have 2 ears, 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 hands. So he's saying you'd be getting 2 streams of information to your soul from the body. One vision from your right eye, from your left eye, and the rest. They need to be unified somewhere. There's a gland in the middle of the brain, which, unlike the rest of the brain, isn't bifurcated into 2 symmetrical halves. It's its own unit in the middle. I'm not sure if he's medically correct or not, but this is his theory. So that must be where all of the incoming information from the left and right side of your body is unified for the soul. And then the soul can create vibrations that vibrate the pineal gland, which then send those very subtle animal spirits coursing through the nerve endings to all the muscles. That tells your muscles how to act. When your sense organs receive information that is sent along through the nerves, and the subtle spirits in the little tubes in the nerves then go to the pineal gland and affect the soul. So there is interaction. But again, how do they interact? How can 2 totally separate substances interact? He doesn't explain how that happens, and that's a problem with his philosophy. All right, so there is, I think, an important point on the top of page 78. He just talks about the nature of the soul. So 3 lines down, he says, the nature of which has no relation to extension, nor dimensions, nor other properties of the matter of which the body is composed. The soul relates to the whole body, not to any particular part of the body, and you can't conceive of a soul having any extension in space. And that's an important point. A soul is not extended in space. It's not a material substance. In other writings, Descartes explains his definition of the 2 substances. A soul is a thinking substance that is not extended in space, and that's human. The symptom of the soul is reason, thinking. And then matter, which is unthinking substance that is extended in space. So there's the crux of his problem. How can something that's not extended in space interface with objects that are extended in space? Okay, so we're going back to page 81, discussion question 1. We'll go over that again, and then we'll do the other two. So compare Descartes' view to the ideas in Hinduism and Buddhism. Which view do you think Descartes' ideas have more in common with? Explain. So again, Descartes does believe in a soul. He does not believe it's eternal. He believes it's created by God at a specific point in time. You can see that on page 73. But he does believe in an eternal, individual, personal soul, and he believes in God. God created the soul. Hindus also believe in a soul, though they think it was never created. It's eternal. It's neither created or destroyed. Descartes says the soul cannot be destroyed. If you look on the bottom of page 73, right after he says that belief in reincarnation is the second greatest error next to atheism, he goes on to say, as a matter of fact, when one comes to know how greatly they differ, that's humans and animals, we understand much better the reasons which go to prove that our soul is in its nature entirely independent of a body, and in consequence that it is not liable to die with it. And then, inasmuch as we observe no other causes capable of destroying it, we are naturally inclined to judge that it is immortal. So, Descartes believes the soul cannot be destroyed, just like the Hindus, but he does believe it was created by God at a certain point in time, and he rejects reincarnation. So those are the similarities and differences between Descartes and Hinduism. Descartes probably, it would be safe to say, has more in common with Hinduism than Buddhism, although he does agree with the Buddhists that the majority of what we perceive to be living beings, all of the animals and plants, they do not have souls. Buddhists don't believe anybody has a soul. There's no individual soul. All there are is fleeting sense impressions and material interactions. There's no underlying unity that stays the same through time and is aware of itself. That's an illusion, say the Buddhists. That's the cause of all of our suffering, this belief in a self, which we should shed. So Descartes agrees. You're right, I agree, animals are like that, but humans do have a soul because we have reason. The Buddhists would reject that. And the Buddhists would say there's no individual human soul, there's no individual cosmic soul, there's no Atman anywhere. All right, so discussion question 2, back on page 81. Plato and Descartes are both rationalists and dualists. Which set of arguments for dualism do you find most convincing, Plato's or Descartes? Why, and explain. I'm going to read discussion question 3 also, because it refers to Descartes' argument for rationalism and dualism. So discussion question 3, explain and evaluate Descartes' arguments for the position that humans are qualitatively different from other animals. We went over that. Humans can talk with each other, we can have conversations. Even humans who can't speak can figure out some kind of symbolic communication, some symbolic form, sign language, or some way of expressing themselves, and they can interact. Humans can interact with each other for any kind of a changing topic of the conversation. Even if it's to say, I don't know what you're talking about. If you continue, okay, you don't know what I'm talking about there, well, let's talk about some other topic. Eventually, if it was a machine, you'd be able to tell this is just a machine responding in pre-programmed ways. This isn't a human. And also humans, unlike animals and machines, we can adapt to any changing physical environment. So reason is an instrument, a universal instrument that serves for all contingencies, Descartes says. That's his argument for what clearly humans are different than all of the other so-called living beings, so we must have something different from the material world. His arguments for rationalism and dualism can't be completely discerned by the few pages that we read here. But based on what we did read here, that's his main argument for dualism and rationalism. We're separate from the material moving bodies, which are the animals, or any machines that might be invented in the future. For Plato, his argument for dualism is his belief in the eternal absolute forms. How did humans know? The example we read about in the Phaedo about the absolute idea of equality. We know when two things are almost perfectly equal, but we've never experienced in the material world any two things which are perfectly equal, yet we judged all of them by that standard. Who taught us that standard? Plato said, nobody taught us that standard. That's an eternal form of knowledge, an eternal absolute idea imprinted on this eternal soul. And when we perceive things that approximate, when we perceive material objects or scenarios that approximate that absolute idea, it activates a memory of that absolute idea. That's his main argument for these two different worlds. There's a world of absolute essences of things, and there's a material world where the shadows of these absolute essences exist. And reason is the ability to recall these absolute ideas. And as I said in the video about Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, he's not as an absolute rationalist as Descartes. On page 65, Plato depicts Socrates saying here in his prison cell, close to the time when he's about to drink the hemlock and die, he said in the middle of page 65, "Yes, Simmias," replied Socrates, "that is well said, and I may add that first principles, even if they appear certain, should be carefully considered." First principles are the absolute ideas. I'm going to turn the ringer on my phone off there. So first principles, even if they appear certain, should be carefully considered, and when they are satisfactorily ascertained, then, with a sort of hesitating confidence in human reason, you may, I think, follow the course of the argument, and if that be plain and clear, there will be no need for any further inquiry. So, Socrates, who we know through Plato's writing, he was a rationalist, but he had a hesitating confidence in reason. We saw the Hindus in the Katha Upanishad specifically say you cannot gain knowledge of the eternal soul through reason. It has to be delivered to you from someone who's already been chosen by God, by Vishnu, by the Supreme Atman. If Atman has revealed himself to some individual person, then that person can teach you about Atman, but nobody else. Looking for it, it's on page 7, verse 9. This knowledge cannot be attained by reasoning. So we see the transfer from not the rejection of reason in the Hindus. It's not that they reject the use of reason, but they're saying you're not going to gain knowledge of Atman through reason alone. It needs to be revealed to you. Then we go to Socrates in Plato's dialogues, and he talks about getting knowledge from the gods through the oracle at Delphi, for example, and that we're born with these eternal forms of knowledge, but at the same time we need to use reason to help us remember them. So it's a kind of a transition. And then we get to Descartes, and he puts this exclusive emphasis on reason. And its dualism is based on that reason. Because humans have reason, that proves there are two different worlds. The world of rational souls, which is occupied by God and humans only. I don't know if he believed in angels, but any creature that had reason, that's emanating from a soul. Souls are totally separate from matter. So those are the similarities and differences between Plato's and Descartes' dualism and rationalism. All right, so let me go back to page 81. Explain and evaluate. This is discussion question 3. Explain and evaluate Descartes' argument for the position that humans are qualitatively different from other animals. Okay, so we've been over that 3 times already. And just know that discussion question 2 and 3, actually all of them, that's a fundamental argument that Descartes makes. We're separate from the animals because we can speak with each other and alter our conversations meaningfully, and we can adapt to any physical environment. That shows we have reason. That shows we're fundamentally different than the animals or any machines that might look like humans. And that's his fundamental argument for rationalism and dualism in the reading that we had here. So if you have any other questions, there's the Ask Me discussion. If you go and hit on discussions, you'll see the tab, the option that says Ask Me. You can ask me there. We have discussion forum 1, which asks, we haven't gone over Hume yet, so it involves that, but you can use that discussion forum. But if you're just wanting to kind of get a orientation before you submit something for your graded discussion 1 forum, you can use the Ask Me forum. You can email me with questions, and that so that's how that will work. And the next video is going to be the next reading in the book. It will be about John Locke.